It's Lee from Colouring Queen, and I thought today I'd colour in Fairy Miracles again for my Markova March colour along. I hope you're all doing really well today. I still have some allergies with a bit of constant itching, but at least the hives have gone, so thank goodness for small mercies. So I have lots of potions from the doctors, so hopefully whatever I'm allergic to or being irritated by clears up soon, so no need to worry. And thank you to those that have checked in with me to see if we're safe from flooding. We are perfectly fine here in Australia, but my heart really goes out to all of those that have been really affected by this terrible weather that we've been having on the east coast of Australia. But anyway, all my itching problems have reminded me of a story that I thought I would share with you. Last time I told you a story, it was back in January, and it was the story of the snail in the bottle. And I'll link to it here if you want to catch up. That story related to a law case in Scotland that became extremely well known in the UK and Commonwealth countries. And among other things, it decided that people that manufacture stuff owe a duty to the people that actually buy the stuff. So that makes it pretty simple. So in Australia, we had our own version of this story a couple of years after The Snail in the Bottle, and it was about Dr. Grant and his underpants and a whole lot of itching, which is why I thought it would tie in with my current life at the moment. And it's also a really important story for people that buy stuff. So Dr. Grant was a 38-year-old man. He's a well-respected GP in South Australia, and on the 3rd of June in 1931 he did a spot of shopping at a retail store called John Martin & Co. in Rundle Street, Adelaide. And when he went there, he asked for some woolen underwear, and he purchased 2 singlets and 2 pairs of long underpants, which people call long johns in Australia. I don't know in other countries whether they do or not. And they were the Golden Fleece brand. They were pretty popular back then. They were made from Australian wool. And nowadays you'd probably only wear that sort of underwear if you were going to the snow, because they're underpants that go from the ankle to the waist. So even though boxer shorts had been introduced at this time in underwear history, a lot of people still really liked the long underpants, long woolen underpants, which in South Australia in the heat sounds really weird, but who am I to judge? And back then, when you were purchasing clothing, you'd actually ask the shop assistant for what you wanted, and they would go and select it from a display case or a drawer. And if you've seen a show called Are You Being Served, it's a British show, then you'll know what I mean. All the underwear was stacked up, and you sort of asked the sales assistant what you wanted and they picked it out for you. So Dr. Grant asked for the underwear. It was given to him, wrapped up in a lovely little parcel, and he didn't get to look at it and browse at it like you would nowadays when it's on racks and you can look at all your frilly knickers to your grandma knickers to whatever you want on a little rack. Back then it was completely different. And I noticed that in Australia there's lots of these little old-fashioned shops that are still around in very small towns like the one where I grew up in. So anyway, Dr. Grant took his parcel of underwear and took it home, and a few weeks later, on the 28th of June, he tried on his singlets and his underpants, and about 9 hours later he started to feel itchy. And it first started at the bottom of the underpants, or the long johns, which were covered by his socks on his shins. So that was made of a different material from the material that goes down the leg. It's like a webbed material, like with a bit of elastic type to it, so it sort of holds and you can put your socks over it. And the next day he wore his underpants again, and I know this is so gross, but apparently back in the 1930s this is what you did. And the itching continued, and by this time his shins had this redness on them, and he had these welts of about 2.5 inches by 1.5 inches wide on both of his shins. So because he was a doctor, he just decided to treat the redness topically with calamine lotion. And then he continued to wear the underwear for the rest of the week. Yes, you heard me, for the rest of the week. Dr. Grant and his underpants only got washed once a week. But apparently this was also quite common back then, which I couldn't think of a day not having a shower, but each to their own. And it was a different time as far as laundering and whatnot goes. So on Sunday, the 5th of July, he changed out of his underwear to the other singlet and long johns that he'd bought, and he wore those for the rest of the week until the 12th of July. And then the first pair of underwear he gave to his laundress, and she washed them, and he changed out to the new one. And when he changed into the newly washed pair, that was the first time that the actual undergarments had been washed following his purchase. So by this time, the redness had really spread, and there were large skin lesions that actually were prone to weeping. And Dr. Grant had been scratching at some of the rash, and some of his rash had actually started to bleed as a result. So even though he was a GP, he knew he had to get a specialist in to see what was going on here. So he consulted a specialist dermatologist on the 13th of July. And I don't know why he waited so long, but I guess being a doctor himself, he thought he could just continue to treat it himself without a second opinion. So Dr. Upton, his dermatologist, tried to establish if Dr. Grant had come into contact with new products that might have set off an irritation with him, like a change in soap or a change in underwear. And the only change was the new underpants that Dr. Grant had been continuously wearing for the last 2 weeks. So Dr. Upton immediately told him to discontinue wearing the underpants, and he prescribed a product for his diagnosis, which was dermatitis, which Dr. Grant followed that advice. He also went back to the shop that he purchased these pants from and to John Martin's, and he arranged to return the underpants that had been washed before being returned. So the first set had now been worn, and it had been washed twice, and the second set had only been washed once. But unfortunately, Dr. Grant did not improve, and his dermatitis actually became more severe. And by the 20th of July, it extended to his left arm, his shoulders, his chest, and his specialist dermatologist advised him to go to bed. And he actually did. He was confined to bed rest for 17 weeks. No internet there, so I don't know what he did. Maybe read books, I don't know. But during this time, he couldn't actually work, and he was in a lot of pain. And the condition eventually became worse, and in less than a month had spread to all of his body, except the soles of his feet and his palms, the front of his chest, and surprisingly his bits and pieces in the front. But these were all later affected, so every part of his body had this awful rash on it, and it was painful. He couldn't sleep, and he just suffered with this intense itching. He had to have sedatives to help him sleep, but often they couldn't be used because they were contradicted or aggravated with the medications that he was on. And during this time, another consultant was brought in to work with Dr. Upton for the treatment, and it was thought at some stage he might actually die from this condition, and his whole body was covered with lesions that were weeping and then scabbing. And blood tests were done to ensure that this wasn't some sort of internal problem or form of disease, and alternative remedies were sought and other treatment methods, but they just irritated it more, and the condition got worse and worse, and the doctors had to abandon that treatment. But they were confused because it didn't present as typical dermatitis, and so at this stage they decided that it was eczema, and it originated from some form of irritant. By September, he was starting to improve a bit, and by November, he was actually able to leave his bed. And on his doctor's advice, he was sent to New Zealand in December to avoid the hot weather of South Australia in December, which would have been extremely unpleasant with that sort of illness. And he stayed in New Zealand until February, and in March he was able to go back to his job. but the irritation soon returned and he was admitted to hospital. He was put on an IV drip and finally left in July after a 4-month stay. And then he was able to return to work, although he still had some of the residual irritation on his legs. So this is pretty severe what Dr. Grant has gone through from just wearing some underpants. Like, I've got allergies at the moment and I couldn't imagine not being able to go around in my day-to-day and being confined to bed with this awful irritation. And I know I had a couple of nights spent where I couldn't sleep and I actually had to take a sedative to stop itching. But I couldn't imagine what Dr. Grant went through in that time, and especially in 1930 where the treatments may not have been as advanced as they are today. So Dr. Grant had returned those undergarments and he was out of pocket. He'd lost income. He'd spent money on treatments, on specialists, on going to New Zealand and recovery, and he'd lost all his income during that time. And he'd really suffered just from the purchase of 2 pairs of underpants and 2 singlets. And he and his doctors were both convinced that these underpants were the actual cause of the problem. And he decided that he would need to sue the retailer, John Martin, who sold him the underpants, and the manufacturer, which was Australian Knitting Mills, that created the fabric that made the underpants and then distributed them to John Martin. And he sued both of them. Now, the retailer, John Martin, they'd sold the goods, and when you buy something, it's meant to be a few things under some legislation in Australia at the time that related to sale of goods. If you let the assistant know that you want to buy certain goods, like I want woolen underpants, they're meant to be fit for the purpose that you want them for. So underpants are meant to be fit to be used as underpants. If you're getting a god-awful rash that keeps you out of work for a year, then they're not really fit for the purpose. And they're meant to be of merchantable quality, which is basically just a fancy pants way of saying that if the buyer examines the goods, that they should be free of any defects which the examination would reveal. So, for example, nowadays when you go down to Walmart or wherever, Kmart or wherever you buy your knickers from, Victoria's Secret, and you look at the clothes, and if you find, say, a hole in the knickers on the racks, then you know that they've actually got what's called a patent defect. You can immediately see it, and it's on you that they were defective if you bought them. But if you can't see the defect, just like that snail in the opaque bottle, then the manufacturer basically implies that they're free of any defects. So if there's something in that fabric that irritates you, and you can't see that on inspection with just your eyes and not a microscope and a chemist, then the manufacturer basically promises that they're free of these sorts of defects and you should be able to buy them and wear them. So that's why he sued the manufacturer as well. And he relied on the snail in the bottle case that had come out in the UK recently. Because things, when they leave the manufacturing plant in the condition that you're meant to purchase it, like you don't need to do anything else, you don't need to put it together, then the manufacturer needs to make sure that the item won't risk the life or property of the ultimate consumer, which is the person that buys it. Seems quite reasonable, I think. So it was up to Dr. Grant to prove that the underpants were the cause of his health problems. And by looking at the facts, it seems quite clear that there was cause and effect. And this was supported by Dr. Grant's 2 doctors that he consulted with for over a year while he was being treated. And the evidence revealed when Dr. Grant sued both in the South Australian Supreme Court that the manufacturing process used a number of products like naphthalene for moth prevention, some arsenic type products, some sulfur dioxide, and these chemicals in sufficient quantity and concentration could cause irritation to a skin that's just normally sensitive. So most of these chemicals were dismissed by the courts as being not of sufficient quantity to actually cause the problem that Dr. Grant had. But the chemicals that they felt could have caused this problem were the sulfur dioxides or other sulfide compounds that were still residual in those underpants when they were tested by 2 to 4 chemists during the evidence stage. So the knitting mills had their chemist test out these products in different parts of the underpants that had been returned, and they looked at them and looked at the amount of sulfates and chlorides that were still there to see if they were of a level that could cause irritation. They were then sent to the University of Melbourne and they looked at various things, and ultimately they both sort of felt that there wasn't enough of these sulfates to really cause the problems that Dr. Grant had. But one of the problems was that the area that this originated from, where the web fabric held the leg together down at the ankle, that actually underwent a different process from the other parts of the long johns, and that's where the redness first started from. So that was treated in a different way by the manufacturing process, and sulfur could be retained in that, and sulfur's in a lot of things in wool, but it was just the levels of it and whether it would cause irritation. So of course the chemists for the manufacturers felt that it was something that Dr. Grant had done, and you couldn't really say that it was the underpants. They didn't believe that there was cause and effect because there wasn't enough chemicals there. And Dr. Grant, of course, had his doctors say, well, he didn't have it before and now he's got it in these areas where this product touched. From Dr. Grant's point of view, unfortunately, the underpants had now been washed 2 times before they'd been sent off for examination. So the chemists weren't really seeing them in the condition that he'd worn them in. So the washing process would have taken a lot of those chemicals out when his laundress had actually washed them. So, they didn't really get to examine something that he was in the same state that he had actually worn it in. Sulfur is part of the wool molecule, and the retailer argued that Dr. Grant had asked for woolen underwear and that's what he got. So if sulfur's in wool naturally, he's got no right to complain. They gave him what he wanted and that's what he got. But the court said there must have been much more chemicals in the product, and when Dr. Grant purchased them and then subsequently washed them, that they'd washed out a lot of the chemicals and only trace chemicals had remained. So the South Australia Supreme Court said, Dr. Grant, we think you're right. These pair of underwear have caused all of your problems and we're going to award you £2,450 in compensation, and the knitting mills and retailer will have to pay your court costs. But the retailer and manufacturer weren't happy with that because they only really had one other person that said that they'd experienced problems from wearing their product and they'd treated their rash with iodine and it had cleared up. So they felt that it was something other than their products that caused this eczema, and they felt that they shouldn't have to pay the compensation. So they decided that they would take this matter further and appeal to what was the appeal court back in those days, which is the High Court of Australia. Now, the High Court of Australia said 3 of the 4 judges actually agreed with the manufacturer, and Dr. Grant had to pay their legal costs. In the High Court, the justices basically said that there wasn't enough evidence to establish that the sulfur compounds in the underwear caused the severe rash, and 3 of the 4 judges said they failed to explain in the evidence to support Dr. Grant's claim for compensation. We don't think that there is a cause and effect here. So the only option Dr. Grant had was to appeal to the highest court that Australian courts were bound by pre-1986, which was the Privy Council in the UK. and the same court that decided the snail in the bottle case. So you can see where this is going to go. And this is what he actually did. And although the Privy Council in the UK never particularly pinpointed a problem in the manufacturing, they said the company's carelessness had resulted in chemicals being in the underwear, and a consumer had no way of knowing that those chemicals were present. So the Privy Council found in favour of Dr. Grant, and he was awarded costs together with the £2,450. But the costs of bringing this legal action all the way to the Privy Council were actually over £20,000. The amount that Dr. Grant was awarded, $2,450, roughly nowadays would be equivalent to about $200,000. But it took him 4 years and 4 months in order to get that decision from the Privy Council. And after that, there was nowhere for John Martin or the manufacturer to go to. That was the final court. And it brought the end to Dr. Grant and his Underpants. But the Lords of the Privy Council said that the disease was by the defective condition of the underwear, and they felt that the initial judge in South Australia was right because he had the benefit of seeing the original doctors that treated Dr. Grant, whereas appeals courts don't review that evidence again, they only review the decision. So they felt that initially the trial judge got it right, and they also felt that sulfur molecules was a negligence in manufacture, and it was a hidden latent defect, meaning you can't see it with your eyes. It's there, those chemicals are there, and you just don't know about it. You can't see it in your eyes. It doesn't jump up and say, hey, I'm an irritant sitting here. But that shouldn't happen, and especially when they're used as they're intended to be used. The most important thing was that they confirmed that relationship between manufacturer and ultimate consumer that the snail in the bottle did. But they also expanded the snail in the bottle, which is why this case is important, because in the snail in the bottle, it was intended by Lord Atkin that applies to things like food and medicine. And I said in the snail in the bottle that I think Lord Atkin would roll in his grave if he'd seen how far his judgment has gone. And this is just one of the first examples, because it went from food, medicine and the like that manufacturers owe the ultimate consumer a responsibility to, but now to clothing because of this case. And it confirmed that whole latent defect. If you can't actually see something and you can't actually reasonably inspect it, then you could be liable in negligence for it. So, I don't know, what have we learnt from this? We've learnt that you should always wash your clothes before you wear them. Always. Whenever I buy anything, I always wash it before I wear it. I'll never let David wear anything that hasn't been washed. And that removes a lot of these chemicals that are still there in the manufacturing process today. Although Australian Knitting Mills, it was eventually bought out by another company and they changed their manufacturing process like a year after this case. So it's not related to them. But there are always chemicals and bits of whatnot in the manufacturing process. So you should always wash your clothes. And if you find something that's irritating you or something that you can't see or find just by looking at it, it doesn't mean that you're not entitled to compensation or you don't have legal rights, because there are hidden things, what we call latent defects, in everything. So for example, when you buy a house, you can't actually see the pipes under the house unless it's one built on stilts or whatnot. So if there's plumbing problems and things like that, that could be a latent defect. So it has a wide application to things, but more importantly, this case and Snail in the Bottle are the cases that are responsible for most of the negligence claims in the world today, particularly in Commonwealth countries. And they're also responsible for most of the consumer protection legislation that is around nowadays, even for things that you would never think of, like your rights renting a property, for example. It's not only applicable to manufacturers and consumers. These sorts of cases are the basis for what we call consumer protection law, and they protect people from their rights. But more importantly, washing your clothes before you wear them will also protect you in the long run from any sorts of irritants on your body. And don't worry, as soon as I started scratching, I thought of Dr. Grant, and as I said, I never wear clothes, and I never give the pets clothes without washing it first, because I know all about Dr. Grant and his dirty underpants, as I've always called it. But it's funny, isn't it, back in the olden days, how people used to wear clothes for such extended periods of time and they didn't wash them. But it was so much harder back then, wasn't it? You had to boil up the water and you had to poke at it with one of those washboards or scrub at it and use your velvet soap perhaps. And there weren't washing machines where you just stuck the timer on and chucked it on while you went for a walk and came back and it was all done for you. It was just such a completely different world. But I just can't imagine wearing underwear for a week. But the court had no problem with that. They felt that there was no reason to even remark on that. That was just normal back then. And as is not washing your clothes, they felt no need to remark on that, because from their point of view it should have been ready to wear as soon as you purchased it in the store. But hopefully we know better now that you should really always wash out those trace chemicals that are in your products. One of the things that they never commented on was how things should be different, which is a bit weird, I think. And another thing that this case and others like it brought about was washing instruction labels on products saying that they should be washed before you wear them, and little notes about how you should care for them and things like that. Some clothes did have those on them back in those days, but most didn't. So this was sort of a lesson, and that amount of money was big money back in those days as well. So sort of served as a reminder to other manufacturers to get their acts together and make sure that they're not affecting people. Yeah, in a lot of ways this case is really interesting for all different sorts of reasons, but I won't bore you with them. But I do think it's important to have a look at these little things in the past and walk down memory lane and see how different people, because of their dog-headedness or their ability to really proceed with something and persevere with it, have made a difference to a lot of other people. Like Dr. Grant could have just taken those underpants back and got his money back and went on his way and just chalked it up to bad luck. But he went through 4 years of legal battles, which might seem like a lot. And I'd like to say the legal system has changed since 1931, but I don't think so. It's still a hell of a long time to go through. He went to the highest court. He took his legal team to London to actually fight this out in the highest court that Australia was bound by. So the cost of paying for them to go to London, all because he believed that he was owed something for the loss that he believed that they had caused to him. And it's like Mary McAllister from the Snail in the Bottle. The lengths that some people will go to ensure that the law is changed and that they've been righted and that been compensated for their loss or the problems that they've experienced. It makes it better for the rest of the world in a lot of ways, because unless someone actually takes the chance and takes the risk and does this, then there's no option for the law to change other than by politicians changing it by legislation. And so often that doesn't happen, or the way it happens doesn't really reflect what they intended. And we can talk about that some other day. So I hope you enjoyed that story about Dr. Grant. I hope it hasn't made you itchy. I think it might have made me itchy. You might have heard me having a little bit of a scratch while we were telling it. I hope you've learnt something, and I hope you enjoyed Dr. Grant's story. I finished up my picture off camera, and basically what I did was just add more of the colours, and I used my art sticks on the background just to bulk put in all of that colour. And then I added some white where I'd actually coloured over things because I'm so clumsy. And I added the white there with some Posca pen. And I know I should probably do more and white dots and little stars and whatnot, but I feel like I'm going to ruin it if I do any more, and I've already spent so long on it, so I'm just going to leave it as it is and hope for the best. But maybe one day I'll return to it and try and be more creative, like so many of you are, who I really admire your ability to sort of just let go and make all these free flowing organic looking pictures. But I'm so uptight, I don't think I can. Well, not at this stage. But anyway, that's it from me. I hope you have a lovely weekend wherever you are in the world. Stay safe and happy colouring.